Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Brissenden Smith, partner with Impact Media Partners, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special live event featuring preview footage from the powerful new film, Single Use Planet, coming to public television nationwide in 2025. Today, we will have a live panel discussion with leading experts from Gannon University, Open Secrets, and the University of Toronto on the politics, science, and environmental impact of single-use plastics, moderated by Suzanne Rust of the Los Angeles Times. We encourage you to share your questions for the panel during this event using either the chat or Q&A feature, as we'll have the opportunity to take some of your questions later in the discussion. At this time, we'll watch a brief trailer for Single Use Planet, and then Suzanne will join us to introduce our panel and begin the conversation.
Plastic, the miracle stuff that's become indispensable to modern life, except for what's not. The throwaway, single-use trash that overwhelms all efforts to recycle. Can the genie be put back in the bottle? We'll look at a way to stop the deluge and what's holding that effort back.
Have you gotten to see what's going on at the Shell petrochemical facility, also known as the cracker plant? 4,500 trade jobs, and it's going to peak this summer at 6,500.
They're saying that they're going to get rid of plastic. You know, they're trying to get rid of plastic straws and all of these other stuff. But the plants are still coming in.
A lot of people getting diagnosed with cancer. When you're burying young people, when you're burying middle-aged people, that's not their time.
I think it's all about money. I think money play a big part in them letting these industries come in here.
We keep buying plastic, using plastic, so they're going to make it here or elsewhere.
There are more lobbyists than there are state legislators.
There is nothing nefarious about that. It is an open and transparent process.
Bags, I tried to ban plastic bags in Louisiana. That went over like a lead balloon. He got killed in committee. I couldn't get it out onto the Senate floor.
Lobbyists don't only bring education and expertise, they also organize fundraisers.
Government has lost its purpose. It's supposed to be here for people, not bottom lines and Wall Street and special interests.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Suzanne Rust. I'm a reporter at the Los Angeles Times, and I have spent much of my several decade career writing about and reporting on plastic, from extraction to recycling and everything in between. And this is a fantastic film, and I'm really excited to have a discussion with these experts about it and with you all. So let's start with our intros. I'm going to begin with Sherry Sam Mason. She is the project director of the Nano and Polymer Technology for Water and Neural Networks, or as she pointed out, the acronym Neptune, at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. Not surprisingly, that's located just a stone's throw from Lake Erie. And we also have here Imre Zeman. He is the director of the Institute for Environment Conservation and Sustainability, as well as a professor of human geography at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, just north and a tad east of Erie, based on Lake Ontario. And last but not least, Sarah Briner. She is the Director of Research and Strategy at Open Secrets. She's here representing Chicago on a third-grade lake. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And I wonder if we could all take a little time right now. I gave your titles and the bare necessities here, but hoping you all could provide us with some opening remarks. Let's start with you, Sam.
All right. So I'm probably most well known for being one of the first research groups to study freshwater plastic pollution. So we surveyed all 5 of the Great Lakes, and as we sailed through them, found that basically as you follow the flow of water, the count of plastics within the Great Lakes increase, to the point where Lake Erie and Lake Ontario have concentrations that are similar to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that is so infamously known. And since then, we've looked at rivers and bottled water and tap water and fish and sediment, and we've looked in a lot of media, and basically anywhere you look for plastic, you find it. Plastic pollution, you find it. So that I will turn it over to Imra.
Thanks very much. I didn't realize the Great Lakes were the connector between all of us. We can talk about that a little bit. So the research that I've done, and I've been looking at the social-cultural dimensions, the social-cultural impacts of fossil fuel extraction. Plastics are linked to that extraction, but more generally, energy production and the energy industry. And I guess there's 2 things about this film that I wanted to raise. I think it does an excellent job of looking at the struggle of 2 communities, one based in Louisiana and one based in Pennsylvania, to try to hold account both the industry and politicians to account for the actions that they're taking, really without any kind of legitimacy or any kind of real consultation with the communities that they're impacting. And I suppose what I want to also say is that those same struggles, those issues that are happening in those 2 places, they're happening at lots of places across the United States, and lots of places around the world. So whether it's about plastics or other kinds of production or extraction industries of various kinds, this is a worldwide problem, and it appears in lots of different guises in different places. Cobalt extraction in the Congo, lithium in South America. And I suppose one of the places, oddly, that I would describe this showing up recently in Ontario on the Great Lakes is in the production of battery facilities, which seems like a great thing. But I would kind of point to the second thing that one of the things that the film does so well is it shows this very, very strong ties between industry and politicians and the way each one uses the other to get what they want. And especially around this rhetoric of generating jobs for people. That's what they really want to try to get across, that this is important because it makes jobs. And that's true too of the battery industry. And what you really have are these big, big transfers of wealth, public wealth from government to industry to do what they want to do under the guise of there being lots and lots of jobs. One thing that I found really powerful about the film is it shows that those jobs are a bit of a fiction. They're about the construction of those facilities, and then that's it. So when I think about the challenge being mounted against some of these facilities, it really has to be around nipping that idea that politicians put out there that these are about jobs. I mean, the other question is about whether jobs matter more than every other element of one's life. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yes. First, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I thought the film was just incredibly impactful and important. I watch it from my standpoint as a watcher of money and a tracker of money in politics. And I think that this issue so exemplifies the way that money isn't necessarily always just transactional. It's embedded into the entirety of our system, from, local races to the presidency, and really just in the way that politics and policy is created in the halls of power. So I think that it just does such a good job of showing that it's not always bags of money under the table, but it's actually relationships that are built with a foundation of money. I also watch the film. I'm a mom of young kids. I live in a South Side neighborhood on Chicago that has a lot of industry of our own. And I sort of watch this knowing that the voices of my community members and my children are always going to be put in conversation with the lobbyists and the corporate executives, and that those conversations aren't always fair. And money plays a big part of that. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have.
Well, thank you all for jumping in there. Just to sort of add here before we watch our first clip, one of the things I was struck by, again, which I think you've all sort of alluded to, was how the film looked at these two communities, but also sort of stepped back and took this broader look at sort of plastic overall. And one of the things that Sam and I talked about quickly on the phone yesterday was just how pervasive plastic is. It is literally everywhere we look. Sam sort of stumbled into it. I've spent years interviewing researchers and experts who were botanists or oceanographers or studied, invertebrates, and they were doing whatever kind of research they do, and suddenly there were little plastic bits everywhere. I mean, I feel like every week I am writing about new research out of medical journals or research journals about they're finding plastic in our brains, they're finding it in our blood. It is such an enormous topic, and I thought the filmmakers were really deft in sort of bringing it to these two communities to show the impacts of the industry itself on the people who live there, and really sort of again underscore this idea that sort of just like as I said, anywhere you look, whether it's from industry, whether from its extraction, whether it's in our human bodies, you will find plastic. It has just become so pervasive in our environment and in our world, and I think they did a really fantastic job at doing that. And after we watch the clip, Imra, I'm going to want to ask you a little more also about this sort of beyond these two communities and beyond what I sort of just went through, the issues around the world, where this has happened. I think I'll talk about it, I think probably repeatedly as we go through this, but that this feels like it's also a story that's as old as industrialization, right? Where somebody has a big idea, they go and extract natural resources from an area, and there's a community nearby that suffers as a result. Anyway, I just again thought that was I thought they did a remarkable job on that. All right, well, I think it might be a little early, but can we head to a clip?
Sure can.
Thanks.
I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't that good news?
1,000 miles downstream from Pennsylvania, where the Mississippi meets the Louisiana bayous, the plastic industry, again invited by elected office holders, has been welcomed by some but not all. And as in rural Pennsylvania, the issue is over the choice of which industry was brought in.
Formosa is proposing to invest $9.4 billion in Louisiana to construct and operate what will be one of the most innovative single-site ethylene and propylene production facilities in the world.
Pollution from the many petrochemical plants along a stretch of the Mississippi River known as Cancer Alley is not the only issue at play. Many of the plants exist on former sugarcane plantations, including those surrounding St. James, a community originally founded as Freetown by African Americans emancipated from slavery. The local citizens became further incensed after learning that Formosa would build on top of sites where enslaved plantation workers were buried, likely their own ancestors. But it's the growing loss now of family members and neighbors and fears for the health of their children that has them filling meeting halls at public hearings to stop the Formosa plant from being built.
I wish they had one of you women up there, and I think we would stand a fair chance. Because women, they think about that their children and their grandchildren, and what do they really want?
I sat down the other day and I took out a page and numbered it from 1 to 50. I got to 35, and that's 35 people that I know personally who have died from cancer just in this area.
All right, well, welcome back. Thanks again for everybody being here. One of the things I was really struck by with this film, here we just saw Formosa. At the beginning of the film, they talk about communities in Pennsylvania. And there's this lovely sort of, not lovely because it's horrible, but the storytelling was lovely in the sense that it took sort of the evolution of these projects. It started with proposed sites in Pennsylvania, the prequel, if you will, and then we fast forwarded to the aftermath. What happens to communities and people once these things have been operating for a while? You know, it looked at what does a community look like once a plastic or fossil fuel plant has been brought to town. And from where I sit, as I already said, and I said I was going to repeat it many times, I feel like this is a story that is told over and over and over again. The communities that absorb the brunt of this industrialization, who are marginalized and ignored politically and economically and any environmentally, any way you can think about it. Then, Emery, you sort of alluded to, and you mentioned earlier that this is a broader issue. This is a global issue. There are communities around the world that where similar things are happening. And I wonder if you could tell us a little more about sort of the evolution of these projects and maybe even, is there any place anywhere where this ever turns out well?
Oh, that's a difficult question. That's a difficult question. So let me, which is completely fine. Let me take a little bit of a step back from that. So we have here, I will get to your question. We have the story here is about plants in the process of being built and what happens to those communities. And I hope it comes across, and I think it does from the film, by the very fact of there being so many plastics in the environment, all of us being saturated with microplastics, that what happened in these two sites has happened repeatedly in the past. There are lots of other kinds of facilities up and running and continuing to run. There is a way in which companies and governments, depending on who builds these, rely on the fact that once something is in place, it's very hard then to do anything about bringing it down. There is this way of kind of naturalizing it. And that's, I don't mean making it part of nature, but making it seem just part of the landscape that makes it seem okay. And that happens over and over and over again. I can think about places that I have visited in my research where there's this incredible facility on the horizon that when I see it, I'm surprised by, but everybody else just kind of drives by it as if it was a light industrial park or something, as part of what a city is or part of what any kind of country needs as it industrializes. So I think I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a sense of just the scale of this. And this film does a good job of showing that by showing the plastic in the world. You see these incredible facilities producing plastic and so on. And that is everywhere in the world. Now, you ask the hard question about whether communities are able to stop some of these projects. There certainly has been successful attempts or successful struggles to stop pipelines. And that has happened both in the US to varying degrees and also in Canada. Indigenous communities have been central in those struggles. There are roles that have been played by some communities in terms of I just know this better because of my research, gas facilities or fossil fuel facilities elsewhere. But for the most part, it is very frustrating that there is this game played that we see these politicians playing, and that no doubt Sarah knows very, very well, where you wear down your opposition. You just make them seem like, well, you do two things. Either you just wear them down or you make them seem kind of irrational. You make them seem like the ones that are holding back progress, that are not allowing for the economy to develop. they're being treated as making all the wrong decisions. And unfortunately, there's a political climate seemingly developing around the world, certainly in the US, that is suggesting that these are more important than ever, these kinds of plants, compared to other kinds of facilities that might do different things for communities and for how we consume the goods that we consume.
So you said something there I think is really interesting, this conversation that's happening. And it wasn't where I was going to bring it up, but I think it's a good place to do it. I watched the presidential debate the other night, and Vice President Harris spoke about fracking, which years ago she had come out against, but is now in support of. And Sam and I spoke about this a little bit, but as with the narrative that fracking is important for purposes of energy, but as we learn in this film, it's really about plastic. And how does that narrative get changed? And we'll talk about this later too, just sort of the industry of plastic and the glut of plastic that's out there. But how does that message get conflated, and how do politicians fall so easily into it?
I don't know if they fall into it or if they're willing accomplices. So I did find that I found that alarming on the part of the vice president. I thought that it was for the purposes of the election more than for making decisions for Americans and for communities. I thought it was, again, this sort of sense of, and this was the way it was presented, and this is why I'm kind of saying this over and over in a sense, that it was presented as the appropriate way, the right way, the rational way to do that, to do the transition that's needed, that you have to have this period in between where you're using natural gas, where you're doing the fracking part is the weird part of it, frankly, but where you're doing natural gas and it's just too fast to go the other way. Even though it would seem to me that it would be in the economic interest and in the environmental interest of the United States to try to be at least catching up with or keeping kind of at the same pace of the adoption of renewables elsewhere in the world. It seems to me to be a competitive disadvantage economically to make the decisions that both former President Trump and the vice president are suggesting here. That idea that gas is an in-between fuel is industry speak through and through. The idea that fracking is important suggests to me that Pennsylvania is a swing state, and perhaps a little more, but it is alarming.
But even more than that, this idea that in fact, like you could see the rationalization behind that, right? I mean, that's why they say it, it's why they do it. People go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But in fact, the fracking that's going to be occurring in Pennsylvania and in this plant in particular is going to be used for plastic. And that's not, so it seems they rest their hat on this argument about this, step in between for energy, but in fact that isn't what it is. And so again, how did that happen? And how do communities or others who are concerned or opposed sort of use that message or use that understanding to make change? And Sam, you live in Pennsylvania and you know these communities. I mean, sort of what are you hearing and understanding about that?
I mean, these industries have lots of money. So if you look at any TV advertising, they're always pushing hydrofracking as Kamala said, it's this, we are lessening our dependence on foreign fossil fuels by having hydrofracking, and that it's meeting our energy needs. And that's how it's always promoted. And so it'd be really hard for someone who's trying to win an election to be on a stage and say, well, really, actually, it's being used for plastics. It would just, I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around, and it makes it really difficult. So she definitely, I mean, I think her approach to it was the fact that she was in Pennsylvania, and there are a lot of jobs that are related to the hydrofracking industry here, and you're not going to win if you say that you're against hydrofracking. And, I mean, she can only make a difference if she wins. That's just the reality, right? So it was definitely strategic. Not saying that's good or bad, just the status that it is. My husband's a political historian, so we had some very open conversations about that during the debate. But I don't know how you change the narrative, because it's really that's what's hard, I think, is as somebody who studies plastic pollution, I know that that's not the reality, that this hydrofracking that's happening, half of it is just simply to make plastics. And so I don't know how you make that more well known. And so that's the difficulty. I'm curious, Sarah, if you have kind of thoughts on all of this, especially as you follow the money in politics, right?
Yeah, this case is interesting because I think, as is often the case with energy issues, we almost assume that this idea of jobs versus regulation is one that is a conversation worth having. And I think the community activists quoted in the film actually help disrupt that narrative by saying, no job is worth my family's health. And that transcends money. But I think that the example of, this goes to speak to how our system is so embedded with money. Pennsylvania matters. We live in this, world where we have the Electoral College. She needs to win Pennsylvania probably to win. She can't alienate these people who are so ingrained to think that fracking equals their livelihood. And that is a relationship and a topic of conversation that has been established for decades prior to her entering this race. And I do think that the youth, people who are at the really receiving end of a lot of this environmental degradation, have a different take on the jobs versus pollution conversation. And I'm curious how the future will look as we start engaging with this with younger people entering the electorate. But as for now, the people who are holding office in Pennsylvania have been largely supported in many cases by oil and gas companies, petrochemical companies. Pennsylvania was pointed out as a state without campaign donation limits. That's a huge factor here. Somebody said in the film they could take $1 million from a donor. That's not true in every state. And you do not want your opponent to take that $1 million. So I think that matters a lot in this case.
Well, and one of the things I found so interesting about that is, as well, is like you look at Pennsylvania, and it has this, or I'd call it a rich history, but a real history of just this kind of thing. I mean, you think about coal mining, right? The steel industry. This is not a place where this dynamic is new, and yet it continues to play out over and over and over again. And does it just come down to money? So, I mean, again, I feel like the youth have seen this before in this very place, and yet they've grown up and it's business as usual. Like, watching money, watching these communities, you hear the people and they don't want this here, the community activists, but they haven't been able to break the mold. What does it take?
I think there's a few things that play in all of that. I mean, one is that you only can envision what you most of us, right, is monkey see, monkey do. And when you grow up in a certain place, that's what you think. So you can't, what else would we have if we don't have this? Right. And so there is this continued, you saw it in the prior presidential campaign, a lot of trumpeting of industry and manufacturing. And that's, we're going to bring it back. We're going to bring coal mining back. We're going to bring industry back, and even though, a lot of the loss there is because of automation, and it's, you're not going to get it back. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it too is, well, I lost my train of thought, so I'm going to let somebody else check.
Well, Imra, I think you were saying early on in this conversation, there's also this element of it becomes part of the background, right? And you get sort of used to it. And so what's a new one? It's just we've got them everywhere. And maybe in these places where there is this long history of this, it isn't as surprising or disturbing maybe as it might be somewhere else. I don't know.
It's as if you imagine that what counts as an industry for smaller communities in Pennsylvania is this kind of industry as opposed to other kinds. It may be that that's the kind of history that Sam was pointing to. I think there's a big disconnect too between the cities in Pennsylvania and the rest of Pennsylvania, and I suppose that's true of Louisiana as well. So that what people in cities might imagine or think is appropriate is not the same as in rural Pennsylvania. It's also interesting that the people that are impacted are in the rural parts of the country always, but the users are the city. I mean, that's mostly where this goes to in terms of where the bulk of the population is. I think what I hear you saying, Suzanne, and I think whatever anybody that watches this film will come away from is, what are we going to do? Like, why does this happen? How could this possibly continue to happen? And I do sometimes think when I looked at this, the other good thing about the film is it focuses on the political process. And as someone who's not, who doesn't live in the US, but let's face it, as a Canadian, we follow US news like all the time. Out of maybe we want to know what's happening. What comes across as really compelling or interesting in the US, it's true of other places as well, is it seems like the function of the political system is only to be reelected as opposed to do anything else. And so just to be reelected, you will do whatever you need to do to get the funds in order to out-campaign your opponent. But it doesn't seem to be on any principles anymore. That seems to be the guiding element. And it may be that one of the ways to address some of these environmental concerns that we're thinking about or talking about and impacts on community is somewhere else than at the site. It may be that where the place to advocate for is electoral reform. Perhaps that's even more difficult, but having 2-year Congress people is a really short horizon, and those people will not make certain kinds of decisions because of that. So I'm not saying go ahead and change your entire political system. That's very, very difficult. But putting some pressure perhaps on campaign donations might make a big difference. The limit to campaign donations in Canada is very, very low. And that means a different kind of dynamic in what politicians do. Now, often their decisions are equally bad, but there's a bit more play in the system than I think is normally the case. We have members of parliament that represent the Green Party, for instance. I think that would be difficult in the United States. So perhaps keeping in mind the limits of the political system, maybe that's the place to put pressure. I suppose this is what Sarah's organization is precisely doing.
Yeah, I'll just jump on that to say that I think that political reform and electoral reform and campaign finance reform are all places where we can address a myriad of issues that face people beyond plastics, beyond fossil fuels. And I would say that it's also an area of hope. There are constitutional factors here as to why the US can't be France, for example. US elections cannot, according to the Supreme Court, be shortened. If somebody wants to scream at the TV for 4 years running for president, they are allowed to do that constitutionally. So you can't shorten the period like you can in France. But there have been quite a few changes at the state and local level where community activists, oftentimes led by people of color, have instituted meaningful reforms. Public finance matching programs are becoming normalized in places like New York State and New York City and Seattle for campaign vouchers, which help to change the people who are running and give them more of a chance in the face of this huge amount of money that has entered the United States system since Citizens United. Arizona has passed pretty significant reforms. Many communities are starting to consider ranked choice voting, which will help elect candidates who might be more representative of the people that they're representing. So that is a place where maybe we won't see change at the federal level anytime soon, but it is a place where we are seeing communities take back control from the moneyed interests across the country successfully.
All right, well, excellent. I think we're at a time where it's time for a new clip. Let's take a pause here and we'll resume.
As Americans continue to use more single-use plastic per person than any other nation, a trend that also drives the pollution involved with making it, the question becomes, can the political will be found to solve this ever-growing problem? Over 380 million tons of new plastic is being made each year, and in the U.S., where much of it is produced, only a small fraction of the waste is being recycled. We're also exporting our single-use debris to other countries, some with poor waste management where it can end up where it doesn't belong. Proponents of a federal bill called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act hope Congress can agree on a solution.
It's practical and it's pragmatic. It's actually built on local and state ordinances that have actually worked. And we're dealing with it from extraction to waste.
It will phase out unnecessary plastic products. It limits exports of plastic waste to other countries. It makes producers responsible for their plastic waste. It puts a moratorium or a pause on new and expanded plastic production facilities.
We want to have a temporary halt on that with this bill to be able to even do an environmental assessment.
A bill that would phase out single-use plastics and thus reduce the need for more industrial production to make it has not been popular with the industry.
It will risk nearly 900,000 jobs and put nearly $400 billion of economic activity at risk.
What you see in this bill is it's more of a punishment tool on businesses, on consumers. It is trying to change behavior through punishment.
So this is an area that I write a lot about, single-use plastics. In California, there's been, we had a pretty significant piece of legislation come through that will hopefully eventually phase out many of the single-use plastics we use. But it does sound like federally, this would be a very difficult piece of legislation to get through, and largely because of this issue we've been talking about, this entrenched industry. The fossil fuel industry has deep pockets and does seem to hold at least federal legislators, lawmakers, and some state lawmakers, within its umbrella. How likely do you think something like this could eventually come through? I mean, again, as we sort of talked about at the beginning, I mean, I think people are really waking up to the fact that plastic is everywhere, and it's not just the garbage down the street, but everywhere. Is it that kind of thing that can get people motivated to change? Is it moms who are realizing when they're breastfeeding their child that the milk they're providing is been infiltrated by little plastic particles? Like, what is it? And are we at a moment where we could see change? Anybody want to take that first?
I think Sarah should go first on this one.
Yeah, I will say I work in a field where pessimism is the norm. But I will also say that, we would never have thought that the Affordable Care Act could happen. We would never have thought that Dodd-Frank could have happened. Major industry disrupting policies are passed. They're not common. They probably, frankly, shouldn't be common. An erratic government policy-making process is no good. But change can happen, and it starts with voters. They are up against a large wall of cash. I have some figures. The oil and gas lobby, so some of those nice gentlemen in the film, contributed to an industry that spent $133 million lobbying Congress last year. $133 million in a year is a lot of money. Add to that spending by the chemical industry, chemical manufacturing industry, that's 65 million additional dollars. And then there are like you said, everybody has a little bit of plastic in them. And I say that as a tongue-in-cheek, sad reference. And also most people have some connection to plastic if they work in an industry. There's those voices out there too. So it will be a challenge. It starts with changing narratives, I think, and not letting this idea that jobs being cut is the only thing that matters to politics. I also want to point out that in California, there was a ballot initiative to ban plastic bags. I believe it passed, despite Formosa Plastics, which is mentioned extensively in the film, spending $750,000 against it. So industry doesn't always win.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like the point you're making there, because so my work was formed the basis for the Microbeads Free Water Act that was passed by Congress and signed into law in 2015 and became effective in July of 2018. And what really led to that happening was people. There was just this huge outpouring of people like sending personal care products back to companies and saying, I don't want plastic in my toothpaste. I don't want plastic in my face wash. And, there was a tremendous people calling their representatives and saying, pass this, and so there was a lot of kind of angst, and industry saw it. So they didn't fight the Microbeads Free Water Act. And in fact, it passed with unanimous support, both R's and D's. Everybody passed it. When does that happen? Never. And the reason that happened is because they weren't lobbying against it, and they weren't lobbying against it because industry saw the writing on the wall. And so, I think a lot of us should feel more empowered than we really are, even with the numbers, as you said, which are quite daunting. When you think about, like, I don't have $133 million to fight back, right? But I think people should definitely feel much more empowered. I do think that industry, what I'm told from my colleagues in the field is that industry is starting to accept that at least parts of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act will happen. Most notably, the extended corporate responsibility, which is probably the key aspect of that suite of legislation. That would be tremendous. And a big reason for that is because it takes the onus of recycling off of the taxpayer and it puts it on the companies who are producing this waste. And that would be tremendous in the United States. So I do think that it's possible. I do think industry sees it happening, coming down the pipeline. And I think a lot of us could do a lot more in terms of pushing our representatives to move it out of committee and onto the floor to face a vote. But they're not going to move it out of committee and onto the floor until they know they have the votes. So, Emery, you have thoughts on this too?
Yeah, three quick points, I suppose. So one of them is in the case of any kind of any of the things we're talking about here, whether it's fossil fuels or plastics or other kind of extraction, the place where one can make the real change is at the site of production and not trying to manage what comes out of it later on.
Yep.
So if you produce less fossil fuels, you have less CO2. And there are movements that have been quite, have made a difference in this. There's the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty movement that has had lots of countries and lots of cities sign on to it. They signed on to a limitation of production rather than all of these kind of fantasies of industry, which is kind of like carbon capture and storage and these kinds of things, which doesn't work. So that's the same with plastics. The other is that I agree, it seems hopeless. Those images are quite alarming and powerful, but there are ways to stop use. So there are lots of places that have banned, the use of single-use plastic bags. It's a small thing, but there are other things that have been developed as well. In Canada, federally, you cannot give somebody, or you should not give somebody, plastic cutlery at a restaurant. You can't give them any cutlery. They have to, when it's for takeout, they have to ask for it. And when they get it, it's now made out of wood. So it's these little kind of things. You don't just immediately stuff a bunch of stuff in your takeout bag. Seems like a small thing, but it's kind of a change of habit. And I'll say just the third thing, it is possible to have a much more robust recycling program. I lived part of the year in rural British Columbia. It surprised me the first time I went to a recycling facility, which I had to take my stuff to, that I had to break up my recycling into 8 or 9 different components. And there was somebody at the recycling facility who would come over and say, no, 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 you can't do that. You have to put this here. You have to put this there. They would take some things out. So that's not possible on the scale of a city, but there are cities in the world where you have to do that breakup. Now, some might say it's impossible to get people to do that, to change. And I always say this to my students. So my mother has a really hard time using the blue plastic bin. She's 79 years old. My son and stepson don't know how not to use it. It's just part of their routine. And so if you had a more robust recycling process, you still want to end it at production, things would happen, as long as then it was treated appropriately at the other end. So there are limits and problems with trying to deal with whatever you have once you've produced it. That's unfortunately still going to be there. That scale shows you that, but it's not impossible. None of it is impossible.
Right. Well, let's take this moment because there are 2 things I want to get back to that were brought up. But I think this last clip will sort of get to it as well. So if we could show that would be great.
As an incentive for Shell to build their ethane cracker in rural Beaver County, the majority of state lawmakers voted for the biggest tax break in Pennsylvania's history. The belief was that it would boost the economy by tapping into the natural gas deep within the state's Marcellus Shale formation. By fracking, the drilling method that injects liquids at high pressure to fracture the rock and release liquid ethane, the main feedstock for making plastic. But from the very start of the Shell project, Pennsylvanians have been divided about the idea.
Pennsylvania residents have a constitutional right to clean air.
The petrochemical manufacturing industry that is waiting to be born will bring economic growth greater than Pennsylvania has already seen from the drilling.
No person's job has a right to make me, my family, and my neighbors sick.
The further use of Pennsylvania natural gas is necessary for greater job creation.
It's a mystery to me why we would permit any of it.
We need this stuff. We need the polyethylene. We use it every day.
Whether or not there's any shortage of plastic being made is another bone of contention, partly because the sheer volume of gas being extracted has spawned plans for more ethane crackers that would add to what critics say is already a global surplus of plastic.
The capacity to produce ethylene and polyethylene in the United States has increased by more than 50%. At the same time, China and other Asian countries have also been vastly expanding their ability to produce plastic. There is way more capacity to produce plastic than there is demand right now.
So I think this got to something I found really, really interesting. Just last week, I published a story about a new technique to recycle plastics. It was only done in a small laboratory, but basically it shows that it's 85 to 90% efficient, meaning whatever you put in, you're going to get that much back. Doesn't use any water. It doesn't use nearly as much energy as either recycling methods used now or virgin plastic. But when I spoke to experts about it, they came back and said, well, here's the thing, right? If you start thinking about recycling plastic, you got to think about all the energy that goes into just doing that and all the money that's required to just do that, right? If you think about the putting it in your bin and then it gets carted off and then somebody has to sort it and somebody has to separate it and then it gets recycled or, you know, shipped off to get recycled, so on and so on. In the end of the day, particularly when you look at that film and they show you this glut of plastic that's out there, why would anybody do recycling? It just doesn't make any business sense, right? It's expensive. How do we get to that point? I mean, there seems to be something really wrong here, right? What's the solution? What's the answer? And then when we get through this, I would love to get to some audience questions, but any thoughts about that? Let's start with you, Imra. You got any?
This is one of those classic examples of the environment not showing up in costs. And that might again be something that we would want to think about. So costs are externalized. It's very difficult to know what the cost of impacting the environment is. That's one of the limits of the way that the economy is set up now. There have been economists that have calculated the impact that our actions make on the planet and have suggested that those might be at least factored into what things cost. Now, can that be done? I'm not certain, but it would be something at least for people to know what they're doing along the whole production chain and what that means for what they're actually doing, what impact they're actually having, what the cost is, not just on the environment in an abstract sense, but on the economy in a concrete one.
Sarah, Sam, do you have any?
I think that this connects to something we talked about earlier, which is like once you build it, it will be used. And we have such a dependence on fossil fuels, and there's so much infrastructure and engineering and thought and training and education programs. And, you know, there's just so much of our economy, our systems, our society that is built around this. And as fossil fuels are shifting away from being the primary target for transportation, right? As transportation is becoming electrified, they're not going to go away, right? You don't see ExxonMobil going, oh, okay, it's been a good ride, bye. No, they're just like, okay, we'll just make more plastic, you know, and so it's just shifting, you know, and this is the problem. And so this is why then, you know, we're not going to stop drill, baby, drill. We're going to keep doing this, you know, because that is the mindset. And so it's a shifting mindset that has to happen. And unfortunately, I think that shifting mindset takes a while. I wish it was faster. That's my thought, Sarah.
Yeah, I think I'll just add that you know, a healthy economic equation does need demand. And there are, I keep saying, but there are active community initiatives in my neighborhood, buy-sell trade groups, you know, reducing the consumption has economic positive outcomes. And I think is something that people are interested in doing, both from their own pocketbook economics and then also because, you know, getting rid of your kids' toys to another family just feels good. It feels good. And it helps. And I think that, you know, we have to look to the good in our communities and our neighbors and our peers. And over time, you know, change is slow, but over time, reducing consumption has to be part of this equation. And companies are going to have to adjust to not being able to sell things. I hope.
All right, well, I'm going to jump to a reader question, or rather statement, although I would love also to talk about exports, but I don't think we have time, just sort of exporting the whole thing somewhere else. But this is from Julia to everyone. I believe the education system also can change by making people aware of how to properly recycle and how to become less of a pollutant by being more aware of our plastic consumption. Talk about eco bricks and where to send them. Consider a rotary system with countries, instead of adding more plastic to our system, already use what we have already accumulated. But what I was interested in is with that statement, the education, like what is the role of schools, of teachers, of universities in also making a change here?
I think that there's a lot of people, there's tons of resources out there to, for educators, but there's also some from the oil and gas industry. So, it makes it hard. I mean, absolutely, we do work a lot with kids. I think that that's a real target focus on the recycling campaigns is if you teach the kids, then they'll grow up as Emre said with his kids, they don't know how to not use the blue bin, right? So I do think that we've been successful on that front. But I also, we can't, as somebody I think pointed out, I'm just watching them pop up on the bottom of my screen. We can't recycle our way out of this problem. And this goes back to the glut as mentioned in the film. There's just too much. Yeah.
I think education is critically important, and then also listening to youth and giving them the tools to be our policymakers. Money in politics keeps new voices out of politics. It just does. It's hard to run for office because it's expensive. We have, I think, one Gen Z member of Congress at this time. So, and money has to play a part in that. So, again, thinking about it in this holistic perspective of how people can run has to be part of the equation. And the youth have a lot to teach us old folks, just as much as we have to teach them.
So we did some colleagues and I did a project over a year. It was virtual with 20, I think it was 25 high schools, groups of kids around the world. And what they did is they would do projects together. But the first thing they did is they taught each other about the energy systems in their countries and the kinds of things that they did actually in with garbage and with plastics. And it was instantly compelling about what it looked like when some kids, I should say they're teens, they're not children, from South Korea would talk to some teens from Costa Rica and learn that the Costa Rican school was completely powered by solar energy. And in South Korea, they couldn't even imagine that. But the kind of education that they get about the possibility of a high school doing something like that is I think great. There are practices around the world that every country doesn't have to reinvent their way out of this. There are ways that we can learn from what has happened elsewhere. And I think what was best about that project is it kind of destabilized the sense of what these kids did. And they recognized that what they did was just habit or practice or just something that their governments expected them to do. So it was fascinating what they did at the end. They came up with kind of a policy outlook that they would use if there was a world government. They would kind of pitch it to that and try to change things.
All right, well, we're at 12:58 and I'm so sad because there's so many questions. So I'm, independently, and then the rest of you in the audience will all have to get together again soon to be able to keep doing this. But before we leave, I just wanted to ask you all if you have any closing statements, anything you just want to get out there before the lights shut out. Want to start with you, Sarah?
Yeah, follow the money. And you can do that at opensecrets.org. That's where all of our content is. And I hope that you keep an eye on who is trying to serve you and who they might actually be serving instead. So look at your legislators, look at your members of Congress, look who's running to represent you, and see where they get their funds at opensecrets.org.
All right, thank you. Sam.
That was brilliant. I don't want to follow that up. No, I just really want people to leave here feeling empowered. And you vote when you go to the ballot box, but also remember you vote every day with your dollars. Not all of us are financially able to make the best decisions. But, do what you can with the resources that you have available. And I want people to leave here feeling empowered. Like you can make a difference just through talking with the people that are around you, through making the small changes in your life. And so, just to be thinking about that.
All right, Imran.
I would just follow or echo what Sam said. Don't be pessimistic. We can see that there's been social change in other sectors of our lives, women couldn't vote at one point. Now they're able to vote. That's an enormous change that happened because of struggle. We have to keep doing that as well. It's easy to be pessimistic about something as important as trying to address climate change. It seems so big. Everything has to change. Well, everything can change as long as we keep at it. Pessimism is an easy way out.
Well, thank you all, and I'll do my plug here, which is also, remember, free press helps bring this information out to the public. And filmmakers, like the ones who did this, provide this information and education. But anyway, thank you all so much. This was so much fun and so interesting. And again, yeah, let's all do this again.
Thanks very much. And thanks to everybody that joined in and participated in this event.
All right, bye.
Thank you for a great film.
Yeah, thank you.
Go watch it.